So next up, we have our first panel on the critical reflections of anti-colonialism and radical imagination with Sarah, Niall, and Aditya. So we're going to just get into a little bit of their bios, and then we'll dive right into the panel. So born in Milwaukee and raised in London, Ontario, Sarah is the eldest immigrant daughter of Malay Palestinian descent. She's a neurodivergent polyglot whose lived experience as a mixed-race diasporic woman fosters her passion for cross-cultural exchange, intersectional storytelling, and cultural critiques. Inspired by her participation in Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival community, Sarah co-founded the London School of Racialized Leaders in response to the June 6, 2021 domestic terrorism tragedy in her hometown of London. Her equity, advocacy, and written work have been featured in CBC London, CTV, and TVO The Agenda. Next up, we have Niall. So Niall is a 23-year-old South Sudanese refugee, writer, and community activist. He spent 11 years in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya and now attends Huron University in Canada. As a youth leader and community activist in Kakuma, Niall initiated Refugee Youth Peace Ambassadors and She Leads Kakuma. He is passionate about the role of education, mentorship, and social entrepreneurship as powerful tools for young people to build better futures in communities. Today, he uses his voice through writing and speaking engagements to advocate for refugees and engage institutions that dominate the world of displaced populations. And next up, we have Aditya, who is a final year political science and history student at the University of Alberta's campus, St. John. Aside from his work as a junior policy analyst, Aditya volunteers his time as the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Lead at Young Diplomats of Canada. During his free time, Aditya is the host of La Francos Oublies, pardon my French, literally, a podcast on which he showcases the diversity of Francophone minority across Canada, all while reflecting on the colonial nature of our official languages. Recently, Aditya was selected for Alberta's 22 Top 30 Under 30. He hopes to pursue a career in policymaking. So thank you so much for being a part of the panel today. All three of you are doing such amazing work, and I can't wait till we get into it, especially specifically in the field of anti-colonialism and radical imagination. You all have vast expertise. And with that being said, our first question is, what do you think a just world would look like? And we will start with Sarah, then Niall, and then Aditya. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Ganya. Just for context, folks, I'm really under the weather, so bear with me. If you need me to repeat things or if you need me to type things in the chat, I can do that. But yeah, I'll try my best to project, but by all means, signal away if things need to be repeated. But yeah, it's a big question. It's definitely a big question, but I guess to make it in like digestible terms, I'd say for a just world, I think a few ingredients we would need is safety, dignity, and agency. So with agency, I think that like it really comes down to choice, right? Like folks, when folks have agency, it implies that you have choice. And even if we think about terms around like consent, it implies choice. And I think a lot of the time when, right now the term privilege is used a lot, and as it should be, right? Like we should be recognizing positionalities, but I don't necessarily think it's an ugly term. I definitely think it's something that is very humbling and should be acknowledged and all the different facets of it. But I also think that privilege also implies like cushions. So I'll use myself as an example. I'm someone with transnational privilege. So my father was born and raised in Gaza, and my mom was studying in the US as an international student on a scholarship. And so the choice for me to be born in the US was an intentful choice. So my dad wanted me to have a US passport because that's something he didn't have. So he understood that with a US passport meant transnational privilege, which meant mobility. And so in a just world, everyone would have mobility, right? Like everyone would be able to cross borders. In a just world, we wouldn't be having ridiculous exchange rates and ridiculous like currency rankings, for lack of a better word. And those two things, a high currency and a blue passport, in fact, two blue passports, because we later immigrated to Canada, so I'm also a Canadian citizen. These privileges that I have by way, like something that I didn't work towards, something that I have no merit for, would be assigned to everyone. And so I think, yeah, the idea of safety, agency, and dignity are important ingredients to a just world.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Niall?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Just to add on what Sarah said, to me, a just world is a world where everyone can live a life of dignity and opportunity. And that means a world where there are less barriers for youth and for people from equity-seeking communities, where we have less discriminatory and less oppressive system. And I think, when I look at a just world concept, one thing that I feel like we always miss is that we talk a lot about, offloading, young people and youth who come from equity-seeking communities and talking about how they're resilient, how they're powerful. But I think in a just world, there'll be, no such things because, there'll be no less discriminatory system that they have to navigate, that they have to fight day in, day out just to prove that they exist and just to prove that, they deserve equal opportunities. So I think a just world will be a world where everyone everywhere can live a life of dignity and opportunity and be able to have access to the tool that they need to build a life for themselves, for their communities, and to be able to thrive.
Thank you so much. And we'll pass it on to Aditya.
Thanks, Daniette. Honestly, I've been taking notes of what the other speakers have been saying because, this is incredible. And a lot of the things that they've said, I had my own notes earlier, but I feel like I'm going to be repeating. For me, I think the most important thing is dignity, and that dignity is interwoven with our identities. And so even though we may each have our own identities, which are very, very different, identifying or those identities don't mean that someone's not going to be treated the same way or something like that. So I think, first of all, I wrote, taking the plight of our most vulnerable and our marginalized groups seriously. And that means recognizing their inherent dignity in the first place. And I think in a just world, and this is a little bit of a different thought, I think would be also cultures being able to tap back into their pre-colonial traditions, their pre-colonial cultures, being able to live those freely, free of judgment. Again, that goes back to dignity, and have those identities with dignity. And so I think that's a huge one. In a just world, we're not feeling like we have to shy away from who we truly are or what we truly were before colonial institutions were put into place. So yeah, I think that's kind of tying everything together here.
No, you guys all touched on amazing, amazing things. And I think it ties very nicely into like the next question about like when we are thinking about a just world, in what ways have you experienced an unjust world? So in your work or life, how have you fought against expectations or dismantled oppressive barriers? And we'll start with Meow, and then we will go on to Aditya and then Sarah.
Thank you so much. As a kid, I was born and raised in Ethiopia. My father fled the First Sudanese Civil War more than 5 decades ago. And I never had a chance to visit South Sudan, which is where I'm originally from. So growing up, the only way I learned about South Sudan was through storytelling. So my dad is a storyteller, and we used to sit down in the evening and he would tell me stories about South Sudan. And then my dad also used to listen to the radio, and through the radio I was introduced to the world outside my village, and I learned a lot about war and peace, human rights, and issues that are happening, in different parts of the world. And learning about those issues, I used to question a lot why the world was just unjust to my father, who had to flee war in several occasions. He had to flee more than 3 times, back and forth between South Sudan and Ethiopia. And South Sudan has been in civil war for more than 4 decades. And my dad has been between all those. So he moved to Ethiopia in 1971 and settled there. Just learning about those, I start questioning the system that we have in the world, the system that are supposed, to fight against those barriers that, that my father was facing. And I felt like, this system is still rooted in things like colonialism, in things like, patriarchy, in racism. And, this need to ensure that, if we really have to, to like envision a just world, we cannot continue, doing business as usual. That means we really have to transform the system we have. We need to have, we need to colonize the system that we have. And, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a journalist. So I remember one day I walked into my classroom and asked my teacher, I asked my father first, how can I be on his radio? My dad used to listen to BBC, and he told me you need to learn very good English. So the next morning I went to my teacher and asked, how can I learn good English? And she told me you need to read a lot of books. So I started reading at a very young age, and that also helped me learn a lot about, the world outside my own world. And then fast forward in 2010, our village was attacked in Ethiopia. My dad sent me away to Kakuma refugee camp where I lived for 11 years. And in Kakuma, in Kenya, they have the incumbent policy, so refugees do not have the right to work. They do not have the freedom of movement. You're confined in the refugee camp for as long as you can be there. I know people who have been there for more than 2 decades. And myself, I never wanted to be confined to the camp because when you're confined in that physical setting, it even confine your thoughts, it even confine your dreams. So I wanted to have access to the world outside. And the only way I could have access to the world outside was through books, was through the internet. So I used to, go into the internet a lot. And I used to read a lot of books. And then, through those means, it was like, like a eye opener, to just see how the system we have worked, including, a system like the United Nations that was managing the camp. I started, getting involved in the community work to help other young people in the camp because I felt like, through the means that I had, I was able, to heal from my trauma. Just getting involved in community service and in advocacy and being involved with the UN. I think there's a lot that you can see when you are in the system than when you're outside. When I was outside, I was just, seeing how unjust the system was and how oppressive the system was. And when I actually started getting involved with governments and the United Nations, international organizations that dominate the world of this place, I start seeing how exactly, this system is still rooted, in things like colonialism and patriarchy. And three important things that I've been trying, to use every single day, day in and day out to fight this oppressive barrier. One thing is speaking up. I think speaking up is very important. So just being able to raise the alarm, because as I said earlier, we cannot continue with business as usual. This system is very much rooted in all these things that I mentioned. And if you really want to envision a just world, we cannot continue with the same system. We have to transform them. We have to decolonize them. So speaking up was key, and just speaking up in a way that we shy away from things like political correctness because things like sugarcoating, because the system is unjust. We know that, so there's no need to try to to sugarcoat the whole thing. If we cannot mention exactly that the system is unjust, and then we'll continue with the way it is because it was built to exclude, and it will take a lot of speaking up to be able to transform it. So speaking up was key. So as much as I have access to table that I was privileged to sit on, including on a number of United Nations committees, I always try to speak up, about those barriers and how they're oppressive to people from equity-seeking communities. The other thing, building a community of solidarity, and that is, trying to see how I can use my privilege in these spaces to build, a community of solidarity around me, of young people, are passionate about fighting this system. So, for example, in Kakuma, the refugee peace ambassadors has worked with over 7,000 young people from more than 10 different countries and nationalities and background. And one thing I always try to do, in my advocacy is I cannot just be in this system, but how I can bring their voices to the table I sit on. So, building that sort of community of solidarity where you have, youth and young people really passionate about, breaking down these barriers and working together, the force, help a lot. And then, the other thing is, by just, seeing myself as not speaking for refugees or for youth from equity-seeking communities, but speaking from that community or from within the community. I think, if we really serious about, decolonization, if really serious about, dismantling, oppressive system, we cannot do it without intersectionality. So being able to see that, and understand that, and I make it clear all the time, that I cannot represent all refugees. Refugees go through very diverse experiences. Those who spend their life in a refugee camp, those who live in urban setting, those who are internally displaced in their own countries. So seeing how I can use my space, to bring together, to bring to light all these different, diversities and experiences, and saying, hey, we need an intersectional lens is very, very important. So those are, ways I've been trying in my own means to dismantle oppressive system.
Amazing. That was such an incredible answer. Thank you so much, Dial. I will pass. I totally forgot the order I said, but I think it was Aditya. If you want to go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. I think this question was the most difficult for me to prepare for or come up with an answer. I think as people who often, as a POC person, as child of an immigrant, these sort of oppressive systems, and they're just there, and you're just so used to going through them that you don't even perceive that they exist. They're just an everyday part of your life. And so to be able to go through your head and be like, oh, these are moments in my life that I've gone through an oppressive system, that only happens in retrospection, but not in the moment. And so I think this question was a nice little moment to reflect and to look back on and be like, oh, these are moments where, there could have been trauma that was made, moments where I've become stronger and things like that, moments that I probably have to talk to my therapist with. Little things like that. So I think I was born in the United States, in New Jersey. My dad was working in Manhattan, and this was in January of 2001. Sorry, that was when I was born. Later that year, as we know, there was the Twin Towers that fell, and racism doesn't see differences, and racism will always try to find a scapegoat. And so my parents were victims to that. And so we fled the United States, since we were especially so close to where the tragedy happened. And we came to Canada. And that was quite a lot of that trauma that my parents faced in terms of racism, and even little things like my mom visibly is, my mom wears a bindi. She wears her sari everywhere to this day, despite being here in Canada for almost 25 years. And she's always been like that. And that, caused her a lot of pain at the time. Other things like looking back within your families, your parents are so conditioned to colonial thought because of growing up in schools, going through schools that taught colonial thought, things like that. So, I started dancing as a child. I do Indian classical dance. And dance is not typically something that boys do. In certain cultures. And so for my parents, it was like, okay, well, what do we do with this boy who wants to dance? My parents were thankfully very supportive. They still put me through dance. I still dance to this day, but in the larger Indian community, it was like, oh, this is a boy that dances. And then there's other conceptions or perceptions that come with it. So it's been about educating people, being like, hey, dance is for everyone. It's a little thing like that. Just something normal. And also it meant educating myself, becoming more secure with myself as well. Educating myself in the sense that going back, looking at how were things before the British arrived in India, when before the Mughals arrived in India and colonized the land for several centuries, and being like, well, this is how things were. And the way that we currently think is the effects of, centuries of colonization. So why can't we think like our ancestors did? And I think in cultures like my own culture, in the Indian culture, we often refer back to, well, our ancestors have done it this way. And to be able to deflect that back at your parents has sometimes been nice, and be like, hey, our ancestors thought this way. I think we should also, go back to those ways and realize that, gender is not necessarily something that we see it currently according to, in the world, that in the society that we currently live in, how it has defined it. I've also grown up in the Francophone community, with my podcast and everything, but even before that, it's been something that's been around me for so long. And I don't necessarily fit the Francophone mold all the time. When we think about Francophones in Canada, you might think like someone wearing a plaid shirt, having an axe, eating poutine, whatnot, these little stereotypes in your head. But a little brown boy in the community with immigrant parents who don't speak the language, that's not necessarily what you think of when you're thinking about the Francophone community. Despite Francophony's just diversity, Francophones can be from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, from all over the world. And so to kind of integrate myself into that community, that was very difficult to do, to be like, hey, I'm here, I'm still a part of the community, even if I learned French at a later time. I'm here to contribute to the community. I am here because I adore the culture just as much as you do. These structures are there so that it can exclude, as Neil said. They don't want us to be a part of the community. They don't want us to be a part of these, contribute to these things because we're different. And to be able to educate and to continually, affirm your identity, which is exhausting in the end. You're always being like, hey, I am a part of this community, despite you not seeing it that way. I am a part of that community. And then people outside of the community telling you that you're not a part of that community or you're not a part of this community. It can be very exhausting, but, it's about affirming yourself, getting secure, pushing your way through. All these things are exhausting. And then once you're there, and I'm going to use, I'm going to fucking shit up, identifying that the Francophonie is a colonial space, that French and English are colonial languages in Canada, that these languages weren't there from time immemorial, there were other languages predating that Francophonie in the other parts of the world were also colonizers, that this language that we speak and unites us is only because we were colonized and our other languages were, we weren't allowed to speak them. And all these sorts of conversations, these are ways that I've been trying to fight oppressive structures, while also, identifying the sensibilities that people, sensitivities, my French coming in here, that people may have with things. So it's a slow, gradual process that means affirming yourself, securing yourself, and pushing your way through. Can be exhausting, like I said, but it's totally worth it.
Thank you so much for that answer, Adithya. I think we can all relate to the pressure of everyone trying to exclude you from certain communities, and then kind of having to be the one navigating that yourself. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'll pass it on to Sarah as well.
Yeah, I'm just kind of meditating on the answers that were shared before me, but I mean, it's this, I also agree, this was I think the question I had to sit with for a bit and be like, okay, there's some simmering happening for sure. Get all the brain juices going. I mean, it's tough because I guess oppressive systems and thought is it's encoded in the air that we breathe, right? It's so intertwined in not just institutions, but culture. And I think that's something I've had to really reckon with, particularly under pandemic, where I've had more time to really, really sit with things and really reflect retroactively. I would say, looking at my own journey, there was definitely a stage where, so in undergrad, I started off in global development. And originally I had intended to work towards maybe working with the UN or an NGO or something like that. And then at the time, I don't know if things have changed, because when I was in school, it was between the years of 2012 and 2016. Those are my undergrad years. So things may have changed. I don't know. But when I was in school, when I looked at the UN internships, a lot of them were unpaid. So you look at something for example, a summer in Manhattan, in the Manhattan headquarters, for example, and it's unpaid. So it's who can afford Manhattan rent? I can't. I can barely afford Toronto rent. Are you kidding me? No way. And so it was very clear the type of student that could go and pursue these opportunities. And it definitely wasn't someone of my class background. And so I started to look at a different direction. I still pursued my global development degree, and I still think that a lot of what I learned informed the way I see the world. But then I doubled with media studies, and I thought, okay, perhaps if I don't work as a practitioner, then maybe I can work towards being a media practitioner where I'm working in the realm of storytelling and working in the realm of working with communities to shed light on different, stories, not just issues, but stories or so on and so forth. And then I had a few years where right after undergrad, I had managed a municipal campaign. And then right afterwards, I produced a web series. So I was very much on this active tense of like, okay, like I'm taking up space, like I'm at like, in the political sphere, it was like, okay, like we're taking up space, like we're advocating for XYZ issues in the London community. And it was a team that I was really proud of. Like we were all racialized, low income, first gen women, all below the age of 30. And that's something I'm still really proud of. But I mean, on one hand, taking up space could be a form of disruption in its own way, but truthfully, the experience was very painful. And it's an experience I wouldn't repeat. Looking back in hindsight, I learned a lot, but I don't think I needed to learn that much that quick. That's what I would tell someone if they came to me at 25 years old, especially when you're not someone who has a lot of access to resources and networks and those barriers are very, very real. And I'm not quite sure that what you take away from that is as worth it beyond like your life lessons. Then I went on and pursued and produced a web series. And in that time, it was still, racialized women, so on and so forth, taking up space. I tried to bring on a lot of other racialized women onto the team, try to open doors, introductions, so on and so forth. But the experience in that was a lot of racialized misogyny. And so that was a huge eye-opener. And what was particularly painful was it was racialized men who was using a lot of equity language to gain my trust and then reproduce a lot of exploitative dynamics. And so that was a huge wake-up call, because like the politics sphere was really painful, but then the media sphere was like even more painful, because a lot of the letdown was people who knew the language very well and who represented these identities. So it's like, I'm inclined to believe you, right? Like I'm inclined to think we're on the same team. I'm inclined to think we're on the same side. And I think that's like still something I'm trying to wrap my head around, even though it's been a few years now. And I think that's in some ways the downside of the democratization of a lot of equity language is like, it's very accessible now, which in a way that's a good thing. But do we exercise responsibility in actually like meditating on what this language means? Because if we're just using it as currency and we're just using it as lip service, then it actually is very harmful, right? Like you develop trust with folks and you can easily just like, gain their trust, use them and discard them. And this act of transactionality or extractiveness is very like, it's like capitalist and colonialist in nature, right? It's like you take and you extract and then you discard. And so there's a lot of literature around this, but this extractiveness is like, it's so insidious because it's not just these big, ugly, like bad guys behaving in these manners. It's like, it's everyday people that can also participate in this. And I don't think I'm innocent either, but I think that it's so pervasive. And so I say this to say, I think there was a stage where I thought it was a lot of these big actions that would be disrupting these big systems. And now that I'm pushing the cusp of 30, I'm 29 now. And I feel like now the approach I'm taking in terms of disrupting these oppressive systems is just trying to foster, frankly, like safer spaces. and trying to develop nurturing relationships with folks to work through a lot of this nonsense. Because like I said, when I first started, a lot of these oppressive dynamics are like encoded in the air that we breathe. And so I don't think I, as a singular person, can really dismantle anything at this stage of my life. That's the conclusion I've come to. And so I think, honestly, collaborating and working with folks and really working on the nurturing side. And honestly, I really believe in TLC, a lot of tender loving care. I think that's my approach in this day, and like in this stage of my life is working with people that I trust and really working on trust building towards shared goals and values. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was like honestly getting me to reflect as well. I think we all kind of go into it being like, I need to do these big things. And then when you get there, like there's like that lack of support and you're like, I thought we were all on the same side. I feel like that's something that activists can all kind of relate to, about being like, oh, we're not on the same side once you actually get into those spaces. So thank you so much for sharing that. All of you kind of touched on a little bit about like the colonial institutions that are kind of currently in place. And the next question that we have is related to the biggest institution when we're talking about it in this realm, the SDG space. So the United Nations has been criticized since its conception due to its role as a colonial institution and its perpetuation of neocolonialism. As activists tend to use nonprofits, governments, and business spaces to do all their activism work, we're navigating participating in and around the UN and its related spheres of influence. How would you, like, what kind of advice would you give us about, trying to navigate these institutional barriers and honestly, like, the internal conflict of this inherently oppressive system? That was a very wordy question, so I'm also going to drop it in the chat. And I'll leave it to the panelists to kind of decide. We'll kind of do this one more popcorn style. So whoever's ready to kind of speak on it can go for it.
I've got some ideas, and I'm obviously going to touch this from only a little bit of it because this is such a huge question. I was kind of looking at this from a mental health perspective, honestly. As activists, we're so used to just pushing. You constantly want to make that difference in your community, make a bigger impact. You want people to not go through what you went through. And so it's easy to just continue to kind of like weave yourself through these colonialist spaces to the point where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm lost. I'm stuck here. I don't know how to get out. And honestly tired, exhausted, all of those things. And so for me, when navigating institutional barriers, my first step is always to have a huge breakdown. And this is no joke. This is straight up like something to do. It is very important to sit down and have a good cry. These capitalist structures just want us to constantly push. They don't want us to take time to have our emotions, feel our emotions, but it's so important to just sit down and navigate your feelings. If you can't navigate your feelings and your emotions, it's going to be difficult to navigate spaces around you. And so I'm all for just team tears, sit down and just cry, have a good cry and before you move on. And then my second thing with the internal conflict with oppressive systems, that's something that I face a lot, be it internalized racism, internalized whatever it may be. These are things that we've been conditioned to think since we were so young, and it's very difficult to undo these ways of thinking. And so for me, growing up with parents who have their own biases, who may have, shared that with me, and then my own biases growing up, it's meant like challenging every single thought, challenging every single idea that comes up in my head. And that's done by reading, usually educating myself, by looking to other racialized folk, other indigenous folk, other folk who have gone through these experiences that I may not, and that I have biases against. and to really open myself to these ideas and be like, hey, I can see similarities with these people. I may not understand what they're going through, but human nature is that we don't really feel attached or, passionate about another person unless we see similarities with them. And so it's really important to, when you look at other people's issues or you're learning about another person's perspective, is to try and see those similarities, try to make those links with your own experience, with your own journey. And that's helped me a lot to, fight these internalized thoughts that are so pervasive in my head. Another thing is when, and I go back to this often, is when the British came to India or South Asia in general, what their most important policy was this Latin phrase, divide et imperia. It was to divide and conquer. And they've done that so successfully around the world with their colonial techniques. If you look back to India and the way dynamics play, Hindus hate Muslims, Muslims hate Hindus, Hindus hate Christians, Christians hate Hindus. It's this like, we've been so divided and we don't look for those similarities and what brings us together as people. And it's important to find collectivity when you're navigating these spaces, finding that'll help you thread through those systems, those nooks and crannies that are going to be very difficult for you emotionally. For myself, at school, I go to a Francophone university, a very small one in Western Canada. But I've found myself a little group of people, racialized folk, queer folk, Indigenous folk, and we've kind of banded together and we have these talks. We cry together sometimes. And it's like this community that you've formed is going to help you get through it. Obviously, keeping in mind what Sarah said about, not everyone's going to always be on the same side as you, but, these communities are still going to be able to take you to that next step. And then my last little note, I guess it'll be my second last, is finding a therapist. I think it's very important that everyone has a therapist. Myself, I think a lot of my perspectives about anti-colonialism or decolonialism happened after I got a therapist. My partner was just, mocking me this morning when I was taking my notes. He's like, yeah, your white Quebecois therapist really helped you with that. And he was joking. But, for me, my therapist has helped me have a lot of these thoughts. And this person was really instrumental in making sure that I was able to navigate through these spaces that not always were welcoming for me. So I think that was huge. And then going back to my idea of, I don't actually know which idea I'm going back to here as I'm looking down at my iPad, but I'm thinking about imposter syndrome. That's the huge one. Just even today, this morning, I woke up, I just sat in bed and I was like, darn, I'm going into a panel where I don't really feel like I should be because I don't think that I have had the experience that are necessary to speak about specific things. And that's, again, another thing that these institutions or these colonial spaces really want you to think is that you're not good enough. And I guess that goes back to having a cry and getting a therapist. So grosso modo, that's what I've got to say.
Oh, thank you so much, Aditya. You touched on so many amazing things. Imposter syndrome, my bestie. I think that's something we always all feel. I'm going to pass it along to any other panelists that wants to speak on this.
Yeah, I can add some thought to what Aditya talk about, and thank you so much, Aditya, for sharing those incredible ideas and thought. As a kid, when I was leaving my village, I never wanted to leave because my dad was not coming with me, and he told me you'll get to this United Nations camp where you'll get access, where they'll give you food, a place to sleep, where they'll take you to school. And while arriving in Kakuma refugee camp, I had this impression of the United Nations as the savior of the world. And, I went to the classroom with that. And then in my classroom, we have like a big Canada flag and the United States flag, because they're like the main donor for the education of the camp. And, through my early years of education, I was seeing them like as the world savior. But as I started, learning more about the world and, the institutions and how they operate and how they were, established, my thinking changed. And just, back to, to what I talked about earlier about, how the system were established, under the impression of trying, to find solution to some of the problems that our world was facing. But they're still, trying to perpetuate the same problem that, they're trying to solve, right? By being rooted in issues, that we all talk about. And, I think it was really, like a transformative, experience for me to kind of, engage the same system. And a few things that I've done, to just try to navigate, this oppressive system, especially the United Nations. One thing is just holding my space. I think, we always got into this very, overwhelming space, where you have, people, who are, privileged, who have, access to the system, what the system was designed for them, not for you. And one thing I always do is, it's just owning my space, owning my story. I see those as, my, my powers, and just trying, to set a standard and say, hey, you know what, I come from this refugee camp, and you have this textbook experience, or I have, life experience. I talk to people who are in the camp, and I think it's very important that you get to listen to me, be really serious about inclusion, and be really serious about trying to find solution. And the way the United Nations is designed, I think there's a big gap, between how it works, but also how it engages the same people that is trying to find solution for their problem. And one thing I'll say when I got to this space is that there can never be an effective solution without involving the communities that are affected. So just trying to hold my space, just trying to bring to light my experience, my expertise on these issues, and just being bold. That is one thing. The second thing is finding a balance, and this is help a lot, on the point of navigating internal conflict that arise sometimes. Just finding a balance, between activism and advocacy. I see them as, activism, working outside the system and just trying to bring about change outside the system, but advocacy is, working within the system. So sometimes I navigate issues and I try to look at, what is the best way, to confront this issue. Should I confront it, from outside or from inside the system? Sometimes there are, situations where, you can, engage the system to bring about change. But sometimes, you really need to do it outside, engage other, other activists and just make noise about the issue. So just trying to find a balance about these issues, is something that helps a lot, especially on navigating, conflict. The last, the third thing is, taking a backseat and educating myself. When I start, getting involved with the UN, refugee agency, that is the first United Nations institution I start working with. I decide to take a backseat and just learn about how the whole thing operates, and that helped a lot, because initially, I was, trying to weigh in all my activism and all my advocacy into the UN, but then I realized, actually the UN, is just, it's managed by 4 countries. Decisions are made by state. It is funded by state. Policy are made by state. There is no single step that the United Nations can make without engaging those states. So just being able, to educate myself and learning about how all these different stakeholders come together and how I can engage them, differently to try to bring about the same change is very important. So sometimes, there are times that I talk, let's say, with a country ambassador to the UN, if there's an issue that I want to flag, or that there's an issue that I want to raise an alarm about, sometimes you talk, to someone who work within the UN. So just being able to understand all these different, stakeholders, and educating yourself about how, they influence the system, is very important, as it will help you, understand and, find ways, you can effectively engage the system. The first thing is questioning the system. I think for me, this is very important. The United Nations has been there for a very, very long time. We have seen, two people, from the African continent, becoming the UN, Secretary General, which is like a very, very big, shift. There's never been, a woman Secretary General of the United Nations. So, I think it's very important, when you see these things, we question the system, if the system, if it's so hard for let's say, a person of color, or a Black, person or indigenous person, to get into this powerful position within the United Nations. What is wrong? Something is wrong. Something is not working, and we really have, to look into the system and see what we need to dismantle in order to, to remove those barriers that this community face, from arising to those positions. So, I find it very important to question the system. Sometimes I sit, on consultation table and I'm like, the first thing and the most important thing we need to do is, we start questioning the system, because, if we do not question the system and then we just, operating all this, solution that will just take us back, to what we're trying to fight. And, something which is also very important, this is the first thing for me. And, it connects with, what Adinse was saying, about mental health, it's just celebrating small wins. I think, trying to, navigate this oppressive system is very, very overwhelming, on your mental health, and just, being able to celebrate small wins is very important. Bringing about change is a very, very long process. When I was when I was a kid, I used to ask my dad, why is, this wrong? Why is it not working? And my dad would tell me, you know what, the person who is making decision on this is that person. And, when I start my advocacy, I thought, oh, when you have a meeting with the minister, that's done, they'll act on it tomorrow, but, it never have worked that way. You need to knock on doors day in, day out. You need to make noise about the same issue. You need to send, thousands of emails. So, just being able to celebrate this small win, and just, how far you've come in trying to navigate those systems is very, very important. So, just taking a, a minute a day and just, celebrate what you have achieved that day, and trying, to use that same energy, to navigate the system tomorrow is helpful a lot. And then the last one is localizing. I find this very important, as much as, I sit on all these privileged spaces, I always go back to the same community where I come from. I believe that transformation will happen from within the community. Social work, happens when you believe that, there's so much power, there's so much resilience in every human being, to overcome, adversity, and, just trying to be, a beacon, that can work with them, to help them, unleash their full potential. So believing in people, believing in community. And, as much as, you work in these spaces, you always come back to the community and, believe that transformation will happen from within. So, these are ways, that I try to, navigate the system in my own world. And, I believe they can be helpful, for other activities as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that was so great, Niall, especially the part about like questioning. I think it's very easy to go into these spaces and kind of just accept, like, I feel like everybody has that moment where, like, yes, the UN, it's the holy grail of activism. That's where I'm trying to work, all of it. So I think, like, once you're, even before you get into the spaces, like really taking the time to question, like, the problematic nature of it is so important, and is like the only way that we can actually like truly help people. So thank you so much for talking about like that balance. I know it's like a very, very tricky one to navigate. And I'll pass it on to Sarah to kind of give us her thoughts as well on this question.
Yeah, I mean, amazing points by both Niall and Aditya. Bear with me, this voice. But yeah, I mean, I think, not to get too repetitive, because I also want to, I want to expand on, I guess I'm going to try to expand on things that have been said. I'll start with, I guess, humility and like positionality. Like I really like to start there. I think that for me, my approach is to really kind of sit with my positionality, because that's dependent on the context, and that's going to be dependent in different spaces. In different spaces, I might be more privileged than in other spaces. So it's not just to be like, okay, yeah, this is my identity and it's like fixed, and therefore it's stagnant. It's like, it's not stagnant, right? Like positionality changes, and it changes with time, it changes with space, it's fluid. And so I try to meditate on that in different spaces I occupy. And I think that's usually a guiding point. I think there are definitely moments in which, you can be overt in addressing certain issues, specifically in situations where, let's say, I have more privilege or seniority or power of sorts, that would be a point in which like it would be important for me to advocate on something, because I have more cushions, right? To go back to privilege and cushions. But then there are other situations in which it might not be safe for me to do so. And so that is an active judgment call I have to make. And that's something I've had to learn over time. And so, yeah, that's definitely, I think, a starting point is like positionality. I had an example of that this week, actually. I'm currently working for a film festival, and we're working towards like a TIFF reception in September. And I looked at the guest list from 2019, because that was the last time we had an in-person event. There's someone on that guest list that is one of the folks that did cause harm when I was doing web series stuff. So in that situation, I ended up speaking to someone I had spoke to a few years ago who I told the whole story to and was like, how do I navigate? Do I tell my manager, or do you tell my manager? Like, how does this work? And so what I really love about the festival I work for is they really actively practice community care. So that's why I felt safe to even disclose years back. And in that situation, she came back to me and she said, you know what? Tell me what you're comfortable with sharing. I'll navigate. Like, I've already flagged to your manager that there's someone on the guest list I want to address something with, and we'll work from there. But like, I'm happy to navigate. And in that situation, yeah, I'm like a junior employee. So there are power dynamics at play. So I'm like, I had to rely on someone else to advocate on my behalf. I still would have done it regardless, because I told this person, like, I can speak to my manager directly, but how do you think this should work? And they were like, I'm happy to kind of navigate, because I might have to flag other departments as well, so that they don't just keep repeating the same name to put on the guest list. So that's like a very tangible situation that actually happened this week. That being said, I would also do the same if the position was flipped. And so a lot of my work with racialized leaders, which is kind of a collective I co-founded and started with two of my really beloved friends who are also just amazing people. That's a conversation we continue to have, is this idea of safety. And so we are I'm trying to find the right word. I'm going to say intentional. We're very intentional with who we develop relationships with, because there's a lot of noise, and a lot of people with a lot of clout, for lack of a better word, are also just really noisy. Like, you know, like there's a Malay proverb that my mom says all the time, and it's like, "Tong kosong banyak bising," which is like an empty canister drums the loudest, right? So it's like, if you're empty, you're going to be loud, right? If you're full, like, it doesn't make a lot of noise. So I've had to, we are like, my team and I were very thorough and very intentional. And sometimes we ask other folks too. That being said, I also take it upon myself when people bring up names of other people to be transparent. Like, I'll be like, listen, at the end of the day, let's say it's an event, it's your event, but from my understanding, these are some things you should know about said person. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. That is, you know, your agency to exercise. But I still feel like that transparency is really important, because if we're going to talk about accountability and all of these big terms, it really has to be exercised at the most micro level, which is, you know, if you know something about someone, it's probably best you share that, especially if you know that they have like patterns of being extractive or causing harm and I think that's at the most micro level really important to exercise, because that's how harmful people continue to hold positions of power. You know, when you have all these like big Twitter stories coming out, it's like, well, yeah, like that didn't just happen because of one incident. That happened because there's been so much room for this person to be sloppy. And so, you know, I think that we all have a responsibility to exercise when we can. And going back to what I started with, it really comes down to in what position, in what context, because it's not always safe to speak up. And I think we should definitely honor that, because it's not worth harming yourself. And I've learned that as well over time. Going back to the mental health side, for me at least, when I was looking for a therapist, it was really important for me to find someone who could not just like understand my identity markers, but who could also speak in this language and like really adopt this worldview. And the current therapist I have really does, because they were the ones who used the term extractive. Like they were the ones who enlightened me that I was engaged in a lot of extractive dynamics. Like that's not a term that came to me out of nowhere. Like it was something that a therapist had like identified. It's like, so these patterns of behavior, this is considered extractive behavior. And I never thought of it that way before someone had shared that information with me. Yeah, so, but also identities, it doesn't always mean that they have like the lens, right? So to give an example, when I was an undergrad, the therapist I was assigned was an Asian woman. She was great, loved her. Everything was fantastic until it was 2014 and there was a lot of news coverage on like violence happening in Gaza. And so I told her, you know, a lot of this news coverage is really triggering. I'm also a media student. And she was like, okay, can you explain to me how it's triggering? And I'm like, man, am I really losing therapy minutes educating you right now? Like, are you serious? So other than that, fantastic. But she clearly didn't have like this epistemic lens to understand my positionality. And there's no need for me to be like, this is triggering, because she just gets it. And she's like, okay, let's work through this. And that's really, really important for me, at least. So I did find my therapist through this site, just sharing with folks. I do love sharing information. I think that's also very important, is like not to get really like chokehold and gatekeepy on things. I think that's another way of working through scarcity mentality and behaviors we've been raised with. But yeah, that's just a resource for folks to share and look up people. But yeah, I'll end there.
No, that was great. I think like the touch on positionality and intention is so important, especially in these like colonial spaces, because like it's so crazy, because I feel like all of us know that we can't just be like dismantle the whole system. Like we are all currently like working within it. So kind of like being really specific about your intention is something that is so important. And I think it leads to my next question. That's like, I'm going to just preface that this is not a question that was sent to you guys, but kind of like approaching from what you guys have been saying. How do you kind of navigate, you know, the knowledge of knowing that you're operating within a colonial system? And how do you think your approach ties to the notions of radical imagination? So kind of knowing that you're kind of working within this colonial system, but you're trying to approach it in a way that's like different, trying to make sure you're not being as extractive. And how do you think your approach links to notions of radical imagination? I'll also drop it in the chat. Another popcorn style question. This is our last formal questions. And then we have had a few questions in the chat that I will be sharing. So if you haven't sent me your question yet, just send it to me. But I've popped it in the chat as well, just because giving the panelists some time, because it is a question that wasn't shared beforehand. Or we can simplify the question of just starting with like, what is your understanding of radical imagination? And then we'll go from there.
I can start.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
No problem. Just because I feel like my thoughts are still fresh. So like, haha, catch them while they're fresh. And while my voice is still working. I think for me, it really, really does come down to relationality. I really think that, you know, so going back to like, so much of this is encoded in like the air that we breathe. It's like, you know, I think some key things that a lot of us are aware of is like settler colonialist culture is individualistic, transactional, extractive. And these are really big terms, and they're very pervasive. And so for me, I feel like the reverse engineering of that would be connectedness and relationality, and really working on, how can we move through, like, I don't want to say collectivist, because that's just like such a big concept as well. Like, it's not like I can just like achieve that in like a second or in like a day, but how do we work towards, solidarity building as it relates to developing stronger relationships? Because I feel like if we don't get that foundation down, then you can't really achieve the bigger picture. And so, yeah, I think moving with intentionality, with a lot of like critical self-reflection, like not just reflection, but like critical self-reflection is really important, because I think I've moved away from thinking about like good versus bad. Like, I think that like that's a very Puritan concept. Like, I think that really falls in a lot of Christian thought as well. If we think about even saviorism and like all of these other things, and I say that from a colonialist perspective. Like, I understand different people have different relationships to spiritualities and religions, but specific to like this like imposition of religion, I think this idea of like good versus bad is a very reductive way of thinking. And I think a lot of it is trying to move away from that binary and moving it more towards responsibility and understanding that it's a spectrum. Like, responsible people can be irresponsible at times. It's very context-based. And so I think that self-reflection and that humility by virtue of that self-reflection helps us ground ourselves in recognizing, hey, like, I might have been irresponsible in this situation, or I can potentially be irresponsible in this situation, and therefore I can cause harm. And that's a way of harm reduction, because there's really no clean cut, right? Like, it's not formulaic. There isn't like, we have a step-by-step instruction manual of like, this is what a decolonized world looks like. I wish. But I think in terms of like key ingredients, it would be starting with, for me, relationality, working towards that, nurturing that, tending that. And that does take a lot of work. Like, I think it's really easy to oversee that. And I think a lot of the time, bringing it back to positionality, I also think that it's also very gendered work. Like, I really think that a lot of emotional labor is very racialized and feminized. And I also don't think that gets acknowledged enough, frankly. And I think it's very invisibilized because it's not valued enough. Like, I think I read, and a lot of feminized labor is not valued enough. Like, I read something recently which made me laugh, and it was like, yeah, Adam Smith also moved into his mom's house when he wrote like Wealth of Nations, so that, she can cook for him and take care of all of the domestic work. And it's just like, oh, great, meritocracy though? Like, this is why the econ bros don't factor in the value of women's labor, because you didn't think about it when you achieved what you achieved. You know what I mean? But I think like these aspects are really important in like relationality, connectedness, and also like outwardly celebrating and appreciating and cherishing. I think like, this work is really hard. And I think we all have our own stories. It's very heartbreaking, right? Like team tears, like it's really, really hard. And another thing I've also moved towards is, as much as it's important to embrace joy, I know there's a lot of discourse around that, and I'm very, very for it. I also think it's important to embrace grief. That's something that a direction I've moved towards. And I've also read some think pieces by particularly Black women talking about how a lot of this work is actually grief work. And I really resonate with that. Like, it's hard. It's like, it's hard. And I think for me, being adjacent to artist spaces, identifying as an artist, I find that like, that's where the imagination comes in. It's like, there are some things and there's some experiences that for me, I can only really work through through the imagination, or through like, you know, through genre. Like, I think Grief in its own way is its own horror film, in its own way. And, you know, in some ways, like A Radical World would be a form of sci-fi. There's a lot of writers of color who use this in their works, right? But I say this to say, I really think that relationality is the key starting point. And I really do think that it's really important to also celebrate each other, because, you know, we can say, you know, more BIPOC this, more BIPOC that, which is all very, very important. But when you see people like putting in the hard work, like shoot them a personal message, just be like, I see you. Because sometimes that's the fuel that you need to keep going.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I read almost all your works on like related to grief and radical imagination. I've actually just dropped it in the chat. I encourage everyone else to check it out. It's really, really powerful stuff. And I'll pass it on to either Aditya or Neil to take it away as well.
I think here, this like a lot of things that Sarah spoke about really vibed with me. Going back to the good versus bad. You know, growing up, you hear like this is doing this is good, doing that is bad, and it's so easy to see things black and white. I've been over the last couple of years kind of trying to tap back into, when I say my culture, I don't necessarily mean the culture that my parents adopt or practice, but rather the like practicing culture from before it was, you know, denatured through different invasions and different colonizations. And there's this word in like Eastern philosophy that's neither good, that's neither bad. It's like everyone follows their own dharma. So you'll hear this a lot in Buddhist philosophy, in Hinduism, in Jainism. Dharma is basically people doing what is right for them, but also for what is right to their communities, to their surroundings. And so everyone's dharma is differently. My dharma as a man may be different from someone else's dharma as a person who is neither man nor woman. There's actual words for that in Sanskrit, which the British tried to hide from us very evidently, and what a dharma of a woman might be. The dharma also differs between people who run a store versus someone who may be a teacher. And obviously there are parts of how dharma is defined may not always be respectful of people's inherent dignity. And so it's important, again, to have that critical introspection and to not just blindly follow something that was followed before. Again, taking in that status quo might not always be correct, or might not always follow or be respectful of people's dignity. I'm kind of just I wrote down a lot of keywords of what Sarah said, because they really stuck with me, and I'm trying to go back to what I was thinking here. I really liked what you mentioned about art. Art for me has been the way that I've been able to express my imagination. I find that language is very, very restrictive, especially as people who have lost our mother tongues. For myself speaking, I haven't lost it, but, you know, being so displaced from an environment where my mother tongue is spoken all around me, where it is just a way of living. There are just expressions that English or French might not have, that my mother tongue has. And so for me, language has always been so restrictive. I've never been able to express myself in a way through writing or through speaking that I feel like really gets me, like where people really understand me. And this is where dance has come in, and it's always been my way of expressing a completely different world where things are better, where things, you know, you can always express these critical ideas, these new concepts. It's important for the viewer of art to be able to understand that. And I think that art often has a way of getting to people in a way that language doesn't. And when I mean art, I mean nonverbal, non-written art specifically. And So I'm thinking specifically of certain groups based in the States that do, I'm thinking specifically of Indian classical dance because that's what I've always practiced. There's this group called Indian Raga, and they've been working on like these projects of taking classical Indian art forms and introducing ideas of people like, connecting back with their sexuality or finding out who they truly are in terms of their gender and things like that. And these have been dances or choreography that I've been really able to connect with in a way that I haven't just reading things or writing things. So I think art is so powerful. I'm kind of I'm rambling and I'm losing my train thought. So I'm going to pass it on to Neil.
Thank you, Aditya. I think I'll just add a few thoughts, and thank you to Sarah for sharing those wonderful ideas. I think when you look at the world today, I said just a few weeks ago that we need revolution for everything because we cannot really transform without, taking radical changes and radical transformation in these institutions, but also, as we know that, these oppressive systems are just everywhere we go, right? Like they are embedded in our everyday life, and they're like the norm. So if we really need change, we need radical transformation. And I think just looking from my point of view, I think a few things that are very, very important, especially for for racialized activists. I think, but also for even youth who come from privileged community. I think one thing that is very important when you think about radical imagination and trying to dismantle this oppressive system. I think we really need to look at and I think Sarah mentioned a bit about that aspect of individual contributions. I think when you look at things like climate change, I went for a march with my friends here in London during Earth Day, and I was just talking to a couple of people and I was saying like it's very important to march. It's very important to make noise on social media, but I don't think making noise and on social media and just going to the street and marching and protest will bring about the change we want. We really need to look at individual contribution, right? I think the personal action and sacrifices that we make in our everyday life will bring about change that we want to see. Looking at climate action, things like maybe stopping using single-use plastic, trying to explore other ways to be more environment friendly can help more than just going to the street, which is important to make noise, but also we really need to look at what are some individual contribution and sacrifices that I can make to really envision the world that I want to see. So I think looking at that is very important. I think the other one as well is community of solidarity. Aditya, I really love your idea of of a band of racialized folk. I think having this community of solidarity, I feel like it's really, really important. Just being able to have a very strong force that can fight this system. I think when you have a community of solidarity, people coming together to share ideas, to share experiences, to cry together, to build a very strong support network. I think those are very, very important. And just being able to create a revolution. And then I think the last one for me is educating ourselves. I think learning never ends, and this system is still being established today. So as much as there's a lot of questioning that we need to do. I also feel that it's very important that we educate ourselves day in, day out, just learning about, the virus that people face, but also, talking with other people as well and learning from them, especially people who come from, similar backgrounds, similar communities, as I was talking earlier about refugee experiences, one thing I look at, that's that, experiences are very diverse, even for racialized folk, even for people from equity-seeking communities, we all go through very different experiences. So, being able to educate ourselves, I believe, is very, very important and helpful in just being able, to have this radical imagination and, being able to create a revolution that can dismantle the system.
Thank you so much, Neil. I think like your point on individual action is so important. I think especially as we saw like the wave of kind of switching into social media activism, people must know like there's accountability beyond that. So thank you so much for touching on that point. And that was the last of our formal question, but we do have a question here from the participants. It is pretty long, so I'm going to read it out and then I'm also going to post it in the chat. So this is from Amanda Rosati. Her question is prefaced by saying, I sometimes hear young folks say that people nowadays are too sensitive, and I find that to be a very ignorant comment. It's always difficult for me to respond appropriately, especially coming from my perspective, and having that awareness and understanding of moral responsibility to learn and to do better, but also how prominent all social issues are in our society, and upset that this type of stigma is still happening. So my question for the panel is, how do you react to this type of comment when it comes up? And if you have any tips on how to protect your well-being when responding, but also bringing their attention to how important it is to having awareness and respect for others. So I'll kind of leave it popcorn style as well, as for whichever panelist is ready to start answering.
I can start. I mean, I really appreciate the question. I definitely think at some point, I mean, people have been saying this from time immemorial. I've been hearing this since I was probably teeny weeny. I've also heard this directed at me specifically since I was teeny weeny. And about maybe now 8 months ago, I lost count how many months it's been. I got a diagnostic that basically I got a diagnostic to say that I'm autistic, which I'm like, now when it comes up, it's like, oh, you're being too sensitive. I'm like, yeah, I'm autistic. Like, I have a lot of feelings, man. Like, it's like, what do you want me to say? And I think at this stage, it's like, if I open with that, it usually gets people to shut up because they don't want to come off as ableist or like whatever. So they start to, but I didn't always have that. I don't always have that as a first deflect answer. I'm half joking, but it is true. Honestly, my answer is so what? So what if people are sensitive? Even this idea of having to be like, like stoic and like this fortitude and, this like, oh, like I'm above feelings. It's nonsense. It's just like, it's complete nonsense. We're human beings. We have feelings. Like before I could say the autistic line, that was my first answer. I'd be like, we're human beings. We have feelings. And like, that's part of the human experience. Why is that something that we should be shaming? And then from there, I engage how much further I want to engage in, because it depends. If this is like an online comment, you're only going to get so far. You can't really convert folks on the internet. That's my philosophy. I've given up. I tried, I'm over it. But if this is a face-to-face conversation and this is something where it really is, something that can be expanded on, then I would press a little further. But my standpoint is, because I think that whole statement of people being too sensitive, like if you really decode the statement, it begins with this positionality that feelings are bad. That's why that statement exists. It's because that person believes that feelings are bad. So what you really want to address is feelings are not bad, because everything else is just mumbo jumbo. They're just trying to like skirt around the subject matter, but the real subject matter is trying to diminish the value of a discussion or an issue or a whatever by using this front-facing like mirage of feelings are bad. And so if you can get to the heart of that, then like they don't really have an argument to stand on.
Thank you, Sarah. Aditya, Niall, any thoughts?
I think for me, I'll just emphasize on what Sarah talked about. It's just, I love, the top first initially, about team cheers. I used to call myself crybaby too. I think, when, today in the world, there's a lot of, let's say in these spaces, political correctness, you're believed to be in a certain way, to act in a certain way. But, I think, it's very important to recognize, that we're human beings, feelings are part of us. And, you cannot really detach your feeling from who you are. and just being able to come from that point where you recognize that your feeling are who you are. They bring about who you are as a person. It's help a lot. Just being able to navigate these issues, and I don't see any problem with being sensitive. There's so much wrong around us that we have to be really sensitive to be able to recognize all the barriers and all the violence in our system that we have. So just being able to come from that angle, even for your individual well-being, of just being able to recognize that it's okay to cry, it's okay to say to be overwhelmed, it's okay to take a break, it's okay to take a back seat and just say I just want to be here for a while. So I think those help in just being able to guard your well-being, which you need to continue doing all the incredible work we do in our communities.
Thank you so much, Niall. Aditya, do you have anything to add?
Honestly, my colleagues here have really blown me away and really have talked about everything here. I think I wouldn't be adding anything, just emphasizing again, once again, the importance of recognizing that we are in this capitalist society where our feelings do not matter. And our feelings, again, they don't matter. Our exhaustion does not matter. Your burnout, no one cares. And you're not too sensitive to flag that, to be like, hey, I'm tired, I need a break, or to be like, this is how I feel, this is who I am, this is my identity, this is how I would like to be identified in the future. These are not sensitive little things. They are inherent to who we are as people. And if always comes back to everything we talked about in that very first question with dignity, it's who you are as a person. And if someone's not going to give you that dignity and is going to label you as too sensitive, you got to move on from that person. And like Sarah said, earlier, it's like, not all these spaces are safe spaces, but you got to move into safe spaces. You got to move on, find those people who are going to be that band of people who are, I don't know where the English word is, but solidaire with you, spaces of solidarity, I guess. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't have much else to add. I just think that these people are going to exist, and we're in a changing world. Our parents were in a changing world. Just because we are sensitive about certain issues doesn't mean that I'm assuming that this comment often comes from people who are typically older than us, because that's who I receive these comments from normally. Those people also had beliefs that they had fought for, and their grandparents or their parents may have also told them that they were being sensitive. This is just a cycle, and it may seem that in our day and age, because of what our parents fought for and their parents fought for, we've come to this era where we are fighting for all of these causes all at once. And so it may seem like we're being sensitive for all of it, but in the end, it's just passion that's being misrepresented as sensitivity.
And yeah, Amanda, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for answering my question. And I wanted to say too that it comes from people of all different ages, even people that are 21, just like me. I was also born in 2001. And so it's hard when they're making these comparisons too of all the olden days and how it was so much more difficult. And yet every time we see that, like, there are still like problems that are occurring, and they're just as valid as the ones that, people from before us had. And so I think it's really important, to recognize that, like, it's okay that we have emotions, and being the sensitive person that I am, I can't hide that. And I don't want to do what society is telling us to not acknowledge that. And so thank you, everyone.
No, thank you so much for your question, Amanda. I think that was such an amazing question. And I think it's definitely comments like that all of us have had to deal with. And I think our panelists did such a great job of answering those questions. We do have one more final question, and then we're going to wrap up the panel. So this one is also with a little bit of context. So the question is, I have had the privilege of being invited to speak in some neo-colonial spaces and then experiencing forms of gaslighting or feeling underappreciated within that space. How do you navigate being invited to spaces that continue to perpetuate harm either towards you or communities that you are a part of? That's a huge question. And I will leave it again open to whichever panelist is ready to answer it.
I've found that in those spaces, it's so important that you are in that space. First of all, do prioritize your mental health and protect yourself. You know, if you find that that space in the end of the day is going to harm you and leave you in a weakened state, do not attend, do not speak at that. At the end of the day, you are the most important person, and your community is also very important. So rally yourself around people who are going to support you. On the other hand, if you find that you are able to enter these spaces, you are being given this platform, it's important to be critical of the spaces that we find ourselves in. You know, for me, my best example is being in the Francophone community and being critical of the Francophone community. You know, it's okay to be part of an organization and still be critical of how the organization functions, who the organization is serving, and who it's not serving. And for me, that's been what I've been doing over the past couple of years is, you know, being like, hey, this organization or this community, because the Francophonie is a community rather than an organization, has been leaving people out, has been excluding people, has been telling people that they do not belong. You know, I had to, and it's honestly, it's really crappy that folks like us have to work our way into these spaces. You know, that's so frustrating in the first place. But once you've worked yourself into there, I think you have the privilege of being able to be critical. Yeah, people are going to give you smack for saying this or that about their organization that they've worked so hard to build. But at the end of the day, you know, their organization is going to fall apart if they're not inclusive, if they're not being diverse, if they're not hearing these voices that are, you know, screaming this message at the top of their lungs. And so, concluding, protect yourself, make sure your mental health is well protected. And if you are able to go voice your opinions loud and strong and, you know, affirm yourself and your community.
I'll pass it on to Niall if you have anything to share.
You know, just to add on what Aditya talked about, you know, I think, you know, it's very important that you recognize that you come first as a person, your mental health comes first, and your community. You know, I think these are the most important things that you need to prioritize. And also, you know, just trying to look at, you know, if you have to be in that space, you know, how will that benefit you? You know, how will that benefit your work? How will that benefit your community? And, you know, also just looking at the harm that, you know, that space could cause you. You know, we come across this system all the time. And you know, I think it's very important to acknowledge that, you know, it's okay to say no. I say no to invitation, you know, all the time. You know, I just I canceled 3 trips last week. So, you know, there's no problem with saying no, because, you know, I feel like, you know, as much as important to be present in spaces, it's important, you know, to have our work appreciated. You know, it's important to know that, you know, being able to be there, you know, will be able to help in, you know, dismantling the system or, you know, being able to help your activism and advocacy work. So, you know, if it's going to cause you harm or leave you, you know, in a weak stage, you know, as Aditya said, you know, I think this, you know, there's no need to be there in the first place. So just being okay to say no, I think it's important when you know, receive invitation all the time, and just being, you know, questioning as well. You know, I think, you know, we get lost sometimes in these, you know, big spaces. So just being able to question critical and say, you know, okay, I have these great invitations, you know, how will this help me? You know, how will this help my community? You know, and you know, what will I gain? And you know, any potential harm. So just being able to consider all those you know, issues that can arise from being there, you know, I think can help you in being able to, to understand if it's okay to say no or yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Neil. I think like the importance of knowing that you can say no is like such a big thing. And I think a lot of times as well, like even the way the question was saying, like I was privileged enough to be invited into this space, like you still have that power to be like, no, if this space is not conducive for you. So thank you so much for sharing that, Neil. And I'll pass it on to Sarah as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely echo saying no should you feel like it's not an opportunity you want to pursue. That being said, it also might be an opportunity you want to pursue. And in the event that it is, something I am trying to put into practice is, I guess like almost like a pre-safety like plan, I guess. One moment. Excuse me. Okay. So a pre-safety plan. So I would say like, considering that how you frame the question, you're well aware that these spaces can be harmful. And so knowing that, I would say, think about how you're going to care for yourself after the fact. Maybe talk to some folks before you go into this event and be like, hey, like, I have this event coming up. I know I'm going to come out feeling very sticky. That's like language I use. Maybe like if you folks are available, like let's like go grab food at such and such time, or let's go watch a movie. Like, find like-minded folks that you can share an experience with after the fact. So it's not just simply a rant session, because you're probably going to want to talk things out anyways, but try to have fun with it, like go grab some bubble teas. I don't know, go grab some yummy foods, go watch a movie, like engage in, a loving dynamic and with folks who would be able to understand if you did have things you wanted to share. So those are some things I try to plug in place. Like for me, it's my racialized leaders team. Sometimes like, we kind of grow and we're like, there's this thing coming up. I know the space is going to be really sticky. But for example, like with the work that we're trying to build, like we're a team of first-gen, low-income, racialized women, feminized people. And so what we don't have is social capital. And it's frustrating. As much as I don't want to dance the dance, the reality is it's also a privilege to say no, right? Like when you're in the phase of trying to build something, you also need to establish recognition. And it's frustrating, but recognition is given a lot of the time through institutional clout. And it's frustrating. So I understand why there's reason to say yes. That doesn't mean you always have to say yes. You make that judgment call. So in the event that you feel like you're called to say yes, just think preemptively, how can I care for myself after the fact? And for me, I make plans with my racialized leaders team members and I'm like, hey, let's do something, because I know I'm going to come out of this event feeling really sticky.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, we cannot emphasize enough like the importance of like a good support system, having those self-care practices in a way that's like special towards you. Do not co-opt like any self-care practices. Make sure that they're like towards you and they make you feel good. So thank you so much for sharing that, Sarah. With that being said, that reaches the end of this panel. Can we please have a huge virtual round of applause for our amazing panelists? I have learned so much just from you all, and I'm sure there's been so many other people within this call that have learned so much. So with that being said, that concludes day one of the Reimagining the Future conference.